Teaching Glass technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
There are providers as well. The provider model is actually a set of DLLs that allow you to store some of the basic information you typically store on most websites you do development on. With the provider model, maybe you need to control membership to your site. Maybe you want to track profile information about your given users or even roles. Now, of course, these are all provided through the providers. Even if you wanted to ignore the provider model completely yourself and say, I'm not going to use any of that, I'm going to do my own membership, that's okay. But the classes you're writing and all the methods within those classes to control all of that, authentication, for example, user lookup, and other profile information, are probably going to be very, very similar to what you already get with .NET with this provider model. We have a separate chapter on that in this course. A web-based configuration management utility, again, this is the website administration utility. It gives you some of the settings within your web.config that you can change. However, I find that IIS gives you many more settings you can use and many more settings you can set. We've also got tools for pre-compiling our web applications, such as the ASPNET compiler, for example, or maybe creating an installer. I know that within Visual Studio 2010 we have the ability to create an MSI, for example, for doing deployment of our web application. Now, mind you, this is going away in the next version of Visual Studio. They are embracing the Wix installer, W-I-X, just like the oil filter you may purchase. It's got the same name. The Wix installer will be part of the next version of Visual Studio. Now, one thing to understand with ASP.NET is, of course, the history of ASP.NET web development. Now, I don't want anybody to groan about this, oh no, not a history lesson, but it is important to understand exactly why we have websites and web application projects, where we've come. Just a few slides here talking about what Microsoft has released since .NET came out. So first things first, in February 2002, they released Visual Studio .NET 2002. Back then they only called it Visual Studio .NET, and this of course was with .NET 1.0. Everything was a project. Guys, you would open up Visual Studio and you'd say, I want to create a Windows project. I want to create a class library project, which is really just a DLL. I want to create a web project. Everything was a project, and it felt like a project. And this was true for both Studio 2002 and 2003. Note that you had to have IIS installed as well. And you had to have those evil front page server extensions installed on top of IIS. I'm saying evil because they caused a lot of nightmare for developers as well as administrators. Front page server extensions are not even supported now with IIS 7 or newer, which is nobody's really missing those things. They were an extra security layer, but earlier versions of Visual Studio required those things. You had to communicate with an IIS server, which could be installed locally, mind you, or you could be connecting to one that might be on the network. Now, when we created those web applications, all of our code behind files, of course, are compiled into one big fat DLL that's located in a special folder called bin. As well, the web pages themselves, which end in that .aspx file extension, would have to be deployed with your site. So just like creating any other project, you create a web application project pointed to IIS, where it would automatically create a virtual directory. Of course, in this, with the front page server extensions, copy the initial files out there as well. You could also connect to an existing IIS virtual directory if you had created it yourself and say, I'd like to create a web application right here. Now, this dependency on IIS was not cool with a lot of administrators. They're like, oh, this is great, so I've got this group of developers and everybody's running their own little web server there. And mind you, not all versions of Windows, back then with Windows XP, for example, they didn't support IIS. For example, Windows XP Media Center Edition and Windows XP Professional Edition did include IIS, but if somebody wanted to do some development at home, maybe they're just doing some work there, or maybe just learning ASP.NET, and they had XP Home Edition, they did not have IIS, so that was a problem. As well, administrators were freaked out about the security implications of it, and sometimes they would say, you know what, I'm not putting IIS on any of your machines. I'm going to set you guys up with Server 2003 or Server 2000 over here, and you'll all have to take turns pointing to that one server. That one server will have all your web application. You're going to have to take turns actually attaching to that server to do debugging. Now that was a nightmare because everybody had to be an administrator on that machine. That machine did have to have Visual Studio installed on it as well as all the other developer tools. That was very problematic. So Microsoft said, you know what? Hearing the masses, they said, we've got a solution to this. I'll tell you what, we're going to create our own little web server that's included with Visual Studio 2005. And this, of course, was released at the exact same time that .NET 2.0 was released. And they said, we're going to get rid of web application projects. No, you don't need that whole project idea. Let's go with websites. That way you guys can just, when you change one web file, for example, or one web page, you just copy it out to your server, you're done. The next time the page is requested on the browser, it's automatically just-in-time compiled, and away you go. So we no longer have to have front-page server extensions. You can actually develop directly in your own folder. And Visual Studio, when you're doing development locally, has its own little web server that'll pop up, so you don't even have to have IIS installed, which was fantastic, right? This was a great idea. We could go ahead and create websites and just point to a folder, an FTP server, or even IIS, and away you go. A little web server would appear down in the tray, and actually this is the same web server that we get today with Visual Studio 2010. It was actually based on a project that was codenamed Cassini, and it's actually written in .NET. And of course, this is included with Visual Studio now, whether you buy the flagship version like Visual Studio Ultimate, or you get the free version of Visual Studio Express. And this is the same web server that you get. And he'll pop up with a funky port number, some port number that's not being used on your machine. Like as you can see in the illustration here, 2764 is the port number that's being used at this point. And he has a little icon there. And you can always shut him down if you want, if you feel he's taxing your server, or if you got too many of these guys running for some reason. Maybe you've had multiple Visual Studios opened up. That's fine. The name of this guy is webdev.webserver.exe, and he starts up automatically by Visual Studio when you launch it. And of course, this was introduced with Visual Studio 2005. I talked about the deployment already, but with websites, Microsoft made it even easier to develop web pages. They said, you know, if you have 100 web pages on your site, with a web application project, that required you to have 200 files you had to maintain within your source control manager, whether it be using SourceSafe or when they released Visual Studio 2005, they released TFS. So they said with websites, let's make it easier. Let's have it so that developers can go ahead and create a single file model where there was one file per web page. And what it would do is instead of doing the spaghetti code model like they did with ASP, is they'd actually separate a separate area within the file that all your .NET code would be written to. That would be typically above all the actual HTML markup. So that made deployment even easier. So you'd modify your one web page, your ASPX for example, copied over to the web server, and then the next time that page is requested, it's just-in-time compiled. And of course, it's storing it in a special location where .NET's installed. That's where the actual compiled code is located. And from then on, it's going to be much higher performing. We did not need front page server extensions anymore, which is a big deal. Besides that, Microsoft has dropped front page, and now we use Expression Web if we want a nice web developer tool, or even Visual Studio Express with web. Now, many enterprises were actually a little upset about this change to websites because they've been working for 3 years since Studio 2002 with web application projects, where everything was a project, right? Whereas websites, well, you know what? They're not a project at all. They don't behave like a project. A website is literally just pointing to a folder. You go put a file in that folder, voila, it'll appear in Visual Studio as part of your site. There was no compilation of everything into one big fat DLL either. Each page is compiled individually. There's no references folder. You know, that's a little crazy as well. You know, we're so used to seeing references in the Solution Explorer window in Visual Studio. That went away as well. If you added a reference to a DLL with a website, if it was your own custom DLL, it'd be copied into your bin folder. Or if it was already located in the global assembly cache, what we like to refer to as the GAC, well, then it would just add an entry to your web.config. That was it. You know, many organizations, I remember talking to an organization down south that said, hey, we've got hundreds of web application projects. We're not going to upgrade them to websites. We're just going to keep the projects. I'll tell you what, we're just going to stay on .NET 1.1. And when people, especially larger organizations, start talking like that, Microsoft freaks out a little bit, as they should, saying, you know what, we still need to support projects. So let's go ahead and create this special add-on called the Web Application Project add-on for Visual Studio 2005. This brought back the capability to create web projects. And eventually they rolled it into Visual Studio 2005 Service Pack 1. When this was released, then developers could either choose to create a website or a web application project. Now this is very important. Because of this capability, and now with the websites and the web application projects, they've just created two entirely different architectures for creating web pages. They can't really drop any of these two. So going forward with Visual Studio 2008, 2010, and whatever the next version of Visual Studio is, guessing a number, 2012, it's going to have to support both architectures.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.